I'm Barb Woolley, and I'm a member of the program committee for NLC, and I'm happy to welcome you tonight. I'm glad it's tonight and not last night, given the freezing rain and the squall that went through. Welcome to the last event of our in-person series on the power of trees. Tonight, I'm so excited about this talk, but I won't put pressure on you, Michael. But before we start, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. The place where we are gathering tonight is the traditional and treaty territory of the Michisaugig, the Mississauga, and Chippewa nations. We offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care and teachings about the earth and our relations to it. May we honor these blessings. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Michael Propikov. I even said it wrong. It's one of those many voweled names. Propikov. He's a cultural historian and a curator whose expertise includes architecture and design, material and visual culture, critical and post-colonial theory. He was born in BC, in Victoria. He did his undergrad at the University of Victoria and then did his master's degree at the University of New Brunswick. From there, he went to Harvard and did a PhD, and he is now a faculty member at OCAD University. He also lectures frequently at Yale University. He's sort of an intrepid, curious person. He's constantly chasing down the latest finds, all sorts of special houses and things to write about. He's written many, many books, and he's a very highly sought after author and curator. He, between 2004 and 2008, our paths kind of crossed. He was the first curator of the Design Exchange, or the director of the Design Exchange in Toronto, the only museum on kind of Canada's sort of cultural design history. He also curated, and I saw this exhibition at the Gardner Museum in Toronto, True Nordic and how Scandinavia influenced design in Canada. In 2011, he curated an exhibition on the work of George Baird. He's an architect and theorist. He was the dean at the Daniels School of Architecture, now the Faculty of Landscape Architecture and Design, and I know that they were close personal friends, so that was probably quite significant. Michael sits on the boards of the Arthur Erickson Foundation, the Canadian Society of Decorative Arts, which my husband Bob and I adore and listen to his talks there, which are always excellent, as well as Studio Magazine. As I said, he's written many books. The latest is a book on painter Hervin Anderson, and just incredibly fantastic honor, was awarded the Historians of British Art Prize just last week? A week before. He has a new book. It's at the publisher right now, and it's on residential architecture in British Columbia. And he had many, many trips up and down the coast into the interior for that. So tonight, after, as usual, we have our talk by Michael. Dr. Propikov will have an opportunity to have questions. So when we're ready for that, then just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. So anyway, thank you, and look forward to this, Michael.
Hello, everybody. So nice to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I am constantly impressed by this organization. Every year, remarkable themes are explored by superb people, and this year is no exception. The idea of dedicating an entire series of conversations to trees is heartwarming and wonderful, because trees are the most important things that we have in our society. People, of course, don't get me wrong, but trees. much. When I was asked to come and speak, I proposed a lecture about the relationship between trees, wood, and furniture. And I will talk a little bit about that this evening, but you will see a slightly different path, maybe through the woods, a different path through the woods. In fact, I have a lot of things I want to talk about in the context of trees, and it may well be that there are so many ideas, I can't actually, and here it comes, see the trees. You know where that's going. I decided to post a land acknowledgement, and thank you, Barb, for what you said. I'm not a great fan of land acknowledgements, but maybe not for the reasons you think. I think we in Canada, settler Canada, have now taken this approach to acknowledging, and I'm not sure how much action is then built on acknowledgement. If we think about settler Canada, Turtle Island, and the ethical obligations that all of us have, whether settler or not, to think about truth and reconciliation and how we can change our society, then the land acknowledgement needs to be a beginning and not simply a thing in and of itself. I often think that land acknowledgements function in the same way that greetings do. How are you? That's a greeting, not a question. Because if you said, thank you for asking, oh my God, it's been quite a week, can I tell you everything about my life? In fact, no. So I put this up because the last 5 lines are important. Collective stewards and caretakers of the lands and waters in perpetuity. I wish that were the case, because it's not the case. Colonialism and imperialism in Turtle Island has seen the removal of Indigenous peoples, the replacement of long-standing systems and relationships with nature substituted by Western capitalist-driven relationships, if that's the right word, that have resulted in ecological catastrophe, desolation, and other very serious social consequences, ecological and social. Well, this is the title of the lecture as I proposed it to your organization, Out of the Woods, Trees as Design Material. It's a perfectly nice title. It's not what we're doing. What I want to talk about today is what I'm going to call Out of the Woods, a rumination in 3 parts. 3 parts on the nature of culture and the culture of nature in settler North America, i.e. Canada. And it's, I hope, a topic that will resonate with some of you, because in my work as a historian and an educator, most importantly, I have found in the last decade or so, since the publication of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that everything I used to think about Canada, my work as a historian, history as a discipline, material life, the things we make and the things with which we live, have been called into question. And that, I think, has surprised some of my colleagues. But I do find an urgency in our collective work about thinking about our society. I'll come back to that. Two things I'd like to share with you. So last week at York University in Toronto, there was a remarkable lecture called the Alchemy Lecture, which turned on the question of manifestos for a beautiful world. And these were ideas about how life could be changed for the better. Indigenous speakers, people of the African diaspora, individuals who have suffered the violence of political regimes, positing in a variety of ways, spoken word poetry, political manifestos, as the title might suggest, an idea of what I call social dreaming. How can we, as people, imagine a world that could be better, not as injurious to our fellow human beings, not as injurious to the land that we occupy, to the water, to the sky, all of these things. And this evening left me in tears. It was one of the most profound occasions in my life to sit and listen to these remarkable thoughtful scholars and activists give to the audience the gift of the invitation to ponder a different world. So I start with that because in thinking about trees as design material, pretty straightforward. Chest of drawers, chair, table. And all of that's nice, but I hope that in the time that you're allowing me to share with you that we can go beyond that. If any of you read the Toronto Star, which you shouldn't need to because it's not a great newspaper, but every now and then it publishes something. Yesterday's paper said, will Ottawa plant 2 billion trees? Because there's a recognition on the part of the federal government and in conversation with provincial governments that the long-standing programs of reforestation in Turtle Island, the settler nation of Canada, have failed. The idea of planting monocrops in places that destroys complex ecosystems which has long-lasting legacies. Now, Barb acknowledged that I'm from BC, so I did the routine BC thing as a university student. You go and tree plant, and I have to say, you walk through the slash and burn of the mountains wherever you got assigned with your thing on the back and your stick. I don't know if you've ever tree planted, but that's what you do. And if you look at the consequences of, tree planting for me 40-odd years ago, we see changed terrain that has had deleterious effects on animals, on weather, on alluvial soil, mountains that are running down into the valleys, and then that's silting up, et cetera. So there needs to be deep change, and then the question will be, is this government, the federal government, best equipped to do this? Now, that question could be applied to lots of questions. Many, many, and I'm not going to be too ideological tonight, but maybe a little bit, because the stakes are so profoundly high. Part 1, clearings in the woods, or quote, the changes and chances of a settler's life. We, in Northumberland County, are in the midst of settler and colonial history. We have lots of opportunities to think about things. Sorry, that slide was out of place, I apologize. The amended title, a consideration of trees, forests, and ideas or a decolonizing rumination in 3 parts on nature, the colonial, the cultural, and the material in settler Canada. Whew. Satellite photo of our place. Canada's remarkable in that it has, next to Russia, the largest biomass of trees of any nation in the world. It's estimated 318 billion trees in Canada. But that number, of course, diminishes with every day. 30% of the world's forests, 318 billion trees, 363 million hectares of forests, 40% coverage of the landmass of the country. So it's arguable that trees in Canada have shaped the settler consciousness of the country. Trees have always been associated with forests. Forests have long been associated with the obligations to clear them, to make that clearing in the woods, to create that pasturage, to turn what's seen as a wilderness into a type of bucolic agricultural place. And that legacy, obviously brought to Turtle Island by Europeans who came here to settle, remains with us. If you read the literature of early settlement in Canada, we have people like Catherine Partrail and Susanna Moody and any number of individuals, Tiger Dunlop, who on the one hand talk about the great potential of the land, always with the condition that you have to get those trees out of the way. Tiger Dunlop says, there's nothing wrong with stumps in your yard. In fact, a yard with stumps shows a sign of industry. But if any of you ever cleared land or chopped down trees, you know that that's not only strenuous work, but we also know that it comes at a cost. A living thing that can, in an instant or in a short while with some axe chops, be felled. There's a remarkable website, and this is a still picture of it. It's called Ocean Planet. And the pink shows tree cover loss in Canada. So we can see, despite the fact of the vast complexity of the boreal forest, which marks the northern part of Turtle Island or North America, that any number of trees thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions have been chopped down. I mean, the map's revealing for a number of reasons. We can see Alaska. That's the Denali Forest in part, the place that President Trump would want us to open up to drilling, et cetera, or would want it to be opened up. And then we can look at Canada, so the area north of Manitoba, Athabasca, Northwest Territories. British Columbia, of course, lots in the pink in British Columbia always, and then the Maritimes. So this, I mean, it's valuable visually because I think it invites us to think about the relationship between economies and national identity and the need to clear land or not. So some statistics again. 2021, 13.6 billion board feet taken out of the forests in Canada. 2022, a little bit of a loss, post-COVID, 13.4 billion. Coverage loss, so this is actually the change in forest to acreage, open sort of acreage. Now, an MHA is 1 million hectares, so 2.3 million hectares of land cleared. We hear about the crisis in the Amazon basin, and we think that somehow Brazil is not doing a good job. I don't know that Canada should be so proud of its record of clearing forests because the consequences are dire. 2021, 11.1 million hectares. I suspect many of you live in this area and have land, cleared land, perhaps some forest. If you have an acre, that seems like a lot. 10 acres is a lot. 90 acres is a lot. 11.1 million hectares of land cleared of trees. So if you look at the last statistic, 0.2% of the forested land in the nation was cleared in 2020. Now, the statistics that I'm not showing you are where that timber would go. These are trees. We know, I'll do an aside, we know that trees are in fact these remarkably intelligent organic entities, and that their root systems are in constant communication with each other. And so that when you come across a grove of trees, you're actually looking at a kinship group, and that they will communicate and they will send their roots over in a certain direction because there's more water or there's more protein or there's more minerals, etc. We know also that urban environments that have landscapes with a tree dotting a street, those trees suffer. There's a remarkable study in Japan in which a scientist has engineered a device that communicates to the public about the tree's well-being. And so a light system will change. So when the tree is not able to get enough something, a light will go off. So this remarkable computer scientist and botanist has tapped in to the vulnerability of trees that are alone, as opposed to trees that exist in, we'll call them families, in communities. This chart speaks to another part of the urgency of the environment and ecology, namely about trees as a place to clean the air, to store CO2. But at this point, because of what I'll call the rapaciousness of the lumber industry in Canada, the forests are not actually able to do what they used to be able to do as effectively. And if you've been following the news, and I know you do because you are thoughtful people, we know that Canada yesterday was indicted by the United Nations saying that we will not meet our target emissions for the Paris Accords. I live in London most of the time, and that government, Mr. Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has vowed that he will not capitulate to European standards, and in fact he's encouraging car purchasing and all of that. So we should need more combustion engines, more CO2 emissions, all of these things. All of which is to say that at this point in ecological time, or what we call the Anthropocene, I think all of you probably know that term, it's the term given to geological history that for the first time reflects the role that humans have played in changing the planet. Every other era in the history of the planet is about the materiality of the planet, but for the first time we're talking about the Anthropocene. And that means the rise of industrialization and the transformation of modes of making, the consequences of which have had an actual and real effect on the operations, the biological, geological operations of the planet. So, clearings in the wood or the changes and chances of a settler's life. Well, I want to start with two texts that have been profoundly important in my life, and they're germane to trees. The first is by Alfred Goldsworthy Bailey, and he was from New Brunswick, a province known for trees. In the 18th century, it was known as the King's Lumberyard. And so when the British naval operations needed masts, that colony was singled out as the best place for white pine. And if you know the white pine, and we can see them if you drive the 401, there's a few of them. They sort of tower above and they're sort of billowy. New Brunswick, in the 18th century and into the 1820s, the predominant ground cover was white pine, great white pine. And they branch out, they rise up and they branch out at 40 feet. 40 feet. And there are accounts, Lady Nugent, who was in New Brunswick, talks about riding her sleigh on pine needles underneath this bower of great white pine. By the 1830s, most of those stands were gone. And now the dominant ground cover in New Brunswick is black spruce. Very different tree. Has a whole different set of implications. Goldsworthy, he was a colonial historian, was interested in the place of colonial sensibilities as culture. The mindset of a place determined by its status within a social organization, empire, or a colonial administration. It's a long text, but he said that, and this is about Canada, he's trying to give us a theory about what this place is for people. And part of what I want to do today is ask a set of questions about Canadian identity and about the legacies of a settler colonial world that was based on agriculture, but never really. It was based on the cutting down of trees and the digging out of minerals and the taking of fish, cod, lumber, ore. And Bailey, you don't have to read this, is really saying that those historical origins of Canada have a lasting legacy. That even though we're a sovereign people, we're sovereign, our mentality or our sensibility might be colonial. And he would suggest, even though Canadians are a proud people, no one wanted Sheila Cops's flag-waving moment. That was bad, if you remember that. And we would say that we're good because we're not Americans, and we're good because we're not British, although I think some people might be squishy on that point. But Canadians may not be so able to say, we're terrific for these reasons. We're sort of a country that tends to understand ourselves in relationship to other places. That we're not that, but maybe we want to be, i.e. Americans. And we used to be that, but we can't be again, even though we have a king, England. And Bailey talks about the colonial as the cultural. Well, the other text that was so important, and this may be familiar to some of you, was Professor Northrop Frye's essay that he wrote as a conclusion to this very important work that was published in 1965 by Professor Klink. And it was called the Conclusion, I spelt that wrong, history, terrible, Conclusion to the Literary History of Canada. But I will read this, so forgive me, but if I were a professor, which I am, and I saw this from a student, I would say, oh, sure, why not a typo? It's perfectly fine. The thought was in the right place. At the heart of all social mythology lies what may be called, because it usually is called, a pastoral myth, a vision of a social ideal. The pastoral myth in its most common form is associated with childhood, with some earlier social condition, pioneer life, the small town, the habitant rooted to his land that can be identified with childhood. The nostalgia for a world of peace and protection with a spontaneous response to the nature around it with leisure and composure not found today is particularly strong in Canada. And in this, I think Frye's addressing the binary around a desire for cleared land that is open and free where the sun gets in, and the fact that the reality of the place is stands of trees. Everyone wants that clearing. We think about Parr Trail and all the others, the backwoods. There is something within Canadian psyche that likes camping, but not permanently, that likes to look at trees from a freeway or vistas of nature that can be mediated by the fact that you know there's that single malt back in that apartment or that suburban home on that cul-de-sac. The idea of actually having to live in the woods, terrifying. And Fry makes that point very profoundly in his essay and uses the phrase which haunts Canadian scholars. It's called the garrison mentality. And a garrison is, of course, a fort. So you think about the processes by which Europeans came to Turtle Island. You deal with the indigenous people. You may remove them from the woods. You may extirpate them. You do whatever you do. And then you set up a little fort, and you use trees. You get those trees, and you make the points. And those are called palisades or palisados in the Spanish. And for Fry, it's the idea that we all live in a fort, and we can look over the edge, over the parapet, and what we see is what? Forest, darkness, wild animals, indigenous people, savagery, terror, darkness. And then you retreat to your little place, thinking that, well, maybe we need to clear some more trees, and maybe clear some more trees. But the question is, are we able to clear trees, or as individuals, or should we capitulate to other things? So these are the two themes that I'd like to have you keep in your mind: the garrison mentality and the colonial, actual and psychic as culture. Well, if you look at early accounts of settlers, we as historians, all of us, have to sort of take them with a grain of salt. But I'm particularly interested in cartography, and here we have a map produced for the first edition of Champlain's Voyages, which he accounted. And if you look at it, what you really see are mountains, of course, in what's present-day Quebec, Newfoundland, and Labrador, a bit of Nova Scotia, and then the inference of trees. This is sort of terra incognita. And it's like, okay, what could you possibly do there? Well, you have to look for something. Imperialism in Canada was always interested in, A, the idea that beyond the water, there might be paradise. Fine. And then also there might be some things you can make some money on. So paradise as a place of profit. And then the image on the right is the first depiction of Port Royal, the fort that the French set up. And it is a classic palisaded fort. Champlain's interesting for our purposes because he reads as a type of New Age guru, if you look at his texts today. The land is the mother, nourishing all her children, beasts, birds, fish, on all the men. The trees provide the shade, the fruits, the flowers, and the woods for the fire. The fire warms us in winter, and by it stay we are saved. It's sort of a nice sort of account of what colonialism might have been about. There's a lot that's missing, but you're going to sort of get this romantic notion. Well, we know that Champlain had a thoughtful relationship with the Huron, not so thoughtful with the Iroquois. But in one of the maps that was produced at this time, we see indigenous life, and I'm particularly interested in indigenous habitation. Those small, rounded buildings are homes, indigenous homes within communities. And then we see an enlarged one next to it, La Forme de Cabane d'Octroi. And we would call it a wigwam. If you think about indigenous culture in the eastern part of Turtle Island, these were structures taken from the materials of the forest: birch bark, poles, trees. They were durable. They protected families. So our first example around the value of the natural world trees is rightly and necessarily directed towards looking at indigenous habitation at the time of European arrival. And one of the things about the wigwam, and ethnographers and anthropologists attest to this, it was, if you want to call it a housing type, it was a housing type that you could find from the Beotucks in present-day Newfoundland, and it stretched all the way down through the Carolinian forest into the Appalachians, to the edges of Florida. John Harriet, a very sort of talented artist, John White, who was working for John Harriet, went to Virginia and gave us remarkable watercolors showing indigenous habitation. And these are honoring depictions. But if you look at the habitations that we saw here, and if you looked at the ones that were drawn by White in Virginia, they are similar, suggesting that there was a unified indigenous culture across Turtle Island at the time of European arrival. Europeans arrived and created a different architectural sensibility. This is reconstruction of a fort in northern Ontario. And again, you see those sharpened pencil-like objects. Right? I always tell my students, and maybe you've heard this saying, beyond the pale. You know what it means? So a pale was a palisade. But anyone know where that phrase beyond the pale came from initially? What's that? Absolutely. So it's an English attitude towards the Irish. So beyond the pale were the Irish. So when you do something that's uncouth, my grandmother always say, oh, that's beyond the pale. But I didn't know that it actually was speaking to some type of imperial conquest of the English in Ireland. So the pale is that fortress, and what's beyond it is savagery, etc. So it's an architecture of protection and violence. Another image showing forts and trees and European settlement in indigenous lands. An early image of a Mi'kmaq settlement in present-day Nova Scotia, again with a wigwam. This picture from the 1830s shows already the complex relations between settlers and indigenous people with the introduction of firearms, the trading patterns, cultures of dependence. If we think about indigenous culture prior to Europeans, it was not peaceable. No human societies are peaceable. But it was based on a cosmological view of the obligations to nature, that you can never take more than you need, and that every time you do take something, you do so with gratitude to the ancestors and to the divine powers that have given you life. One of the first maps of what we would call Upper Canada. So as you know from your history, Upper Canada was created when the large colony of Quebec was severed at the Ottawa River, in large part to provide land for those people called the United Empire Loyalists, or Tories, who left the revolutionary colonies, i.e. states, in the United States. And if we look at the settlement of Upper Canada, it was based on the idea of, well, John Graves Simcoe giving orders to set up townships from Cataraqui all the way along down to what was Newark or Niagara-on-the-Lake. Orthogonal grids, forested land, clear the land, create a society. Well, a few early images. Fort York in 1803. And again, these are the first legislative buildings, fuzzy as they are. Maybe legislatures are always fuzzy. And then we see a type of fortress building, a type of palisaded part. The shore of Fort York, a small fledgling settlement against the lake with a backdrop of great white pines. Log cabins, the idea of transforming trees into habitation, early drawings from 1795 of close to York, and you can see the interior next to it. I just want to show you some drawings of depictions of early settlement in Canada, where it's always against a backdrop of that impenetrable forest that, of course, on the one hand is the source of that which allows habitation, but is never so sufficiently removed as to thwart fear. This is from Bartlett's prints from 1840, a very important publication based on drawings done in Upper Canada and then translated into, this is one of the watercolors, and then translated into engravings. And what we see is a group of settlers around a fire, and then the small sort of log cabin being built. Niagara-on-the-Lake, that clearing, agricultural land, some large houses, the sort of hillocks, and the advance of what would be called settlement, sort of classic Upper Canadian log cabin, using 6/6 windows, a concession to Palladianism, but arguably a type of frontier establishment. Frontier establishment. The romanticization of Upper Canadian settlement for European audiences. So Canadian scenery, 1840 on the left, of all the things that those publishers could put on the cover of their book as the frontispiece, they of course made the choice of an indigenous encampment, so a canoe and a type of wigwam and 3 indigenous people. Roughing It in the Bush by Susanna Moody, we see a sort of a different type of scene, but not unrelated, the little log cabin and that reassuring plume of smoke against that backdrop of forest. Images from Bartlett, the romanticization of settler life, which you needed to romanticize it because the British government was intent on getting immigrants. And so these books not only were affirmational, showing pictures of what life was like, or at least might have been like, or in fact was not like it at all, but nonetheless might have convinced people there to take that invitation and move to Upper Canada. And so again, the town of York. Well, if we think about this culture in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century of this settlement called British North America, colonies tied to Britain. In 1851, and I'm sure people have seen this image, in 1851, Prince Albert, the consort of Queen Victoria, decided to organize the first fair of the industrial nations in the world. And so it was France, Germany, the United States, and Britain. There was, in the early conversations, a bit of a concern that Britain had colonies. And how do you factor in colonies for a fair that was about industrialization? And so the agreement was, well, you could show what the colonies contribute to the economic well-being of the mother country. And so this was the Canadian Pavilion, as it was called, the collection of objects sent by authorities from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Upper Canada, and Lower Canada. Ironically or problematically, or perhaps explicably, this was designed by a German architect named Gottfried Semper. Semper was from Bavaria, talented, had very sort of serious but romantic ideas about wildness, and thought that whatever Canada was, it of course would be wild, and that it was necessary to communicate the realities of this set of colonies way over there and what they did for empire. So when we look at this, it exercises, to me, a little bit of agitation because it seems to truck in stereotypes. Of course, there's a birch bark canoe, an indigenous birch bark canoe that's suspended over the entire booth with a British flag hanging out of it. So it's sort of the fur trade, indigenous dependence, etc. Sleighs and sleds, because of course, our country, mon pays, ce n'est pas un pays, c'est l'hiver. It's that sort of idea, it's just a place of winter. The mounted taxidermed animals at the side. And then, in the pedimented cabinets, referencing architecture, the collection of minerals gathered by a guy named William Logan, who was the first sort of official geologist for the colony of Canada. But this display, hugely popular, also sort of a type of pitch for come to Canada. Well, one of the high points of this was Semper's Canadian Timber Trophy. 34 pieces of Canadian wood, different woods, assembled in a towering object, capped, of course, by an indigenous canoe, and the whalebone of some type of big sea mammal. If this represents the country, it represents the country as a source of goods, trees that can be cut down and milled into timber that can prove profitable for people, and also the basis for settlement and transformation. So this really is, as Bailey would tell us, culture as colonial. Well, what types of uses would Canadian timbers find? This is, if you can believe it, Osgoode Hall at the top of the shot, and this is York Street, and so we're on Queen Street. And you look, there are these little clapboarded Georgian vernacular buildings in what Eric Arthur, the architectural historian, told us as he described Toronto. His phrase was "no mean city," meaning there was a lot of significant things going on in Toronto. Osgoode Hall, I mean, that is an established, that's justice. What do you need in a colony but justice and then development? Well, same year as the Crystal Palace exhibition, the first Canadian postage stamp. And of course, how better to represent those colonies than Castor Canadiensis, the animal that proved to be the economic benefit of New France and Quebec, the fur trade, the idea of the staple theory. And in many ways, it's the denizens of the forest that become equally emblematic of the Canadian experience. All those creatures that for Indigenous people would have been living in part of the cosmological world, but in the sort of systems of economy of extraction become simply profitable. And if you look at the numbers of animals taken And I won't bore you with all the statistics. But in 1784, for example, in northern Quebec, 1,400,000 beaver pelts. And you think, okay, that's a lot of action on the part of trappers, and it's a lot of beavers, and it's a lot of ecological disruption. And then there was elk, and there was mink, and there was and all of that. So, Canada as a place of extraction. Fort Garry, indigenous canoe, wood to create a trading post. Romantic images from the 1850s and 60s of that cabin in the wood, hauling the lumber off that you felled in order to create fields in which you grow crops. Past Canada, present, this was the dream. A little cabin that's rough, made out of logs in a forest, suddenly becomes a type of mid-19th century farmhouse with cleared land and agricultural workers. But just some images. You can just sort of look at these. Log cabins in the woods. People confronting trees, thinking, how many hours will it take? I mean, the thing about agricultural settlement, and of course foodstuffs are necessary, and human society has always been marked by the transformation of landscapes so that people can survive, if not thrive. But in Canada, I would argue there has been a culture of rapaciousness tied to the colonial dependency of the country. Rather than becoming a place of industry, we have resorted and still resort to digging up the ground and cutting trees down in order to transact business on the global scale. The vast majority of Canadian wood products are exported. A huge number of those trees and those hectares that were cleared are turned into pulp. I grew up in British Columbia, and in certain parts of BC, that smell of a pulp mill. And if you said, oh, that stinks, people would say, that's jobs. The lumber industry in Canada across time, horses pulling logs out of the forest, logs being floated down. This is the Gatineau River. What better, the idea of our government institutions there in Ottawa, with the Ottawa River clogged with the trees being felled in the remarkable forests north of that place, Bytown, that rambunctious town. A postcard from Vancouver showing two children sitting on a knoll on a yellow cedar tree, and you get the immensity of that tree. And we can think that that tree, 700 years old. The tree to the right, Douglas fir, the dominant species in coastal British Columbia. That tree, 500 years old. But of course, trees, because they're so embedded in the Canadian psyche, have always been the subject of sort of fond depiction. Tom Thomson's wonderful sort of autumnal scene of a lake in Algonquin Park with a great white pine. And then Emily Carr using sort of the aesthetics of modernity to depict the sort of deep, umbrageous world of the forests. Both of these artists and lots of others who were working, whether with the Group of Seven, with which Thompson was affiliated, or later with Emily Carr, practiced cultural erasure. The forests of Turtle Island that were the habitations of indigenous people are not the forests depicted by these artists. These are pristine landscapes, absent people. There is a type of voyeuristic gaze that both these artists are presenting to us, looking into that forest, whether as a place to be feared or as a possible place of profit. Part 2, modern furnishings for modern forts, or woods for goods. Well, I brought in a wonderful volume published by the Canadian government, by the Minister of Resources in 1951. And it's an astonishing book because it's a mix of science and the promotion of a Canadian lumber industry. So lots about cellulose, lots about biology, all of that. But it also is making a very clear point that Canadian woods mean profit for Canadians. So on the front and to the right, I wanted to show you the image. So at the top, we see a laboratory where wood products can be turned into any number of commodities, similar to the type of sensibility of the 1851 exhibition. The natural resources of Turtle Island are there for the taking and can serve as profit. But the scene below it, and it's wonderful, it's a round disc of a tree, right? Sort of nice piece of graphic design. A modernist interior with wood paneling and wood furniture, and a very happily, arguably white settler family socializing their children. An image in the interior showing this grand tree, not any specific species, but in it all of the possibilities. Up at the left, we see lumbering, then we see the mill, we see the lumberjacks rolling logs, then we see factory life, then we see telephone poles and railway ties, we see a bowling alley, we see ships and all, housing. This is what the Canadian forest is for. It's about social progress, the transformation of life from a wilderness that happened to be the habitats of Indigenous people into a place for a modern Western democracy. But a modern Western democracy that is always caught between a rock and a hard place. Is it a perpetuation of Britain, or does it want to be America? And one of the things about modern design, the embrace of the aesthetics of that movement from the 1920s, is the idea that out there, wherever there is, there's a world of cosmopolitan allure, sophistication, urbanness, being part of something bigger than yourself. Whereas Canadian culture is always, well, we're sort of over here, I'm sorry, we're still over, sorry, we're over here. And we may like older things, but not fancy urban things. So the other image shows, again, a lovely sort of stylized stand of forest, the trees, the logs, the mill, down to science and technology. And of course, ironically, the book at the very bottom of the image, Canadian Woods. More trees. You figure the old growth forests of Turtle Island were largely gone by 1810. New Brunswick, I said 1820s. British Columbia later because it was settled later. But we know that those stands of old growth forests in the Claycoit Sound and everything, not to be protected. Industrial technology for stripping the forest. The representation of the realities of the Canadian settler economy and culture. Here we have a fur trading camp with a wigwam, and this is a stamp from 1941. The mechanization again, truckloads of logs. Floating logs, the left is British Columbia, the right is Quebec. So that entire surface of the river are trees. This is intentional. These boats intentionally tip. You load the boats up, and then you tip them into the ocean, and then they float down. And this is the Forest Prince. I like the name of that boat a lot. British Columbia. The first mill in Victoria. First steam mill. The application of steam pressure technology to power the saws, which could increase yield. The coast of British Columbia, up by Kitimat. Quebec. Quebec. There is something romantic about the lumberjack, about the life in the woods, about the deep snow, about navigating those streams and living a community of camaraderie in the service of clearing the forests. But volumetrically, we have to think about the implications of cutting trees down and not necessarily reforesting in the ways that are best for the environment. But then how does one reconcile notions of progress, ideologies of material advancement, with the responsibilities of being stewards of the natural world? Indigenous cosmology would have no understanding of this other than just abhorrent, deep upset. The idea that the sacred woods can be felled in an instant, whether by an axe or by some type of animated technology, in order to make what? all the things that we need. Paper. I write books, I know about paper, I like paper. But I'm always aware that everything is complicit. Nothing is not related to something else. Now, these images importantly come from the official, every year the Canadian government would publish the Handbook of Canada. And they're quite remarkable surveys of the country in a year. And of course, because these are promotional, they're not critical. It's not saying, oh dear, we might have a real serious ecological problem on our hand with clear-cutting forests. Rather, it's each industry, mining, lumbering, fishing, etc. And then there's a section on the arts because, we have dancers and singers here. And then on cities because who doesn't like a city? And then on sort of rural folk. But ultimately, these are economic documents, and they consistently will portray these types of scenes. So this is timber ready to be pulped, a mountain. And the landscape, this is in British Columbia, the landscape of those heaps of trees mirrors in a certain way or forms the same type of the outline of the mountains in the distance that are stripped of their trees. Pulp. Prince George. And have you ever been to Prince George in British Columbia? Smelly place. A lot of jobs. The idea of celebrating trees and this industrial world, I find the Canadian postal system, like many postal systems, and don't get me wrong, silviculture, the cutting of trees, the United States, the Baltics, Russia, every country has depended on taking the bounty of the land for the service of its people. But somehow Canada, because of its small population, because of its colonial fragility, because of its determination not to be American, we defeated. General Brock did what he had to do, and here we are. But that type of insular independence tied to Britain resulted in a sensibility that would not be able, and still is not be able, to think beyond the rapaciousness of extractive industries. The fact that you would put on your postage stamps, made out of paper, a depiction of the process by which you could have a postage stamp that would allow you to write to your distant aunt in England saying, we're doing okay here in our small clearing in the woods. The thing about modernity, that project of social transformation, turns on technology. And the Canadian wood industry was important in many, many ways. First, in the contributing to the Allied victory in the Second World War, the production of mosquitoes, if you know that plane. A wood plane made in London, Ontario, and other places, and in Quebec. So here we have a mosquito assembly plant. And these were these agile light bombers that really made a profound difference. So my conversation about wood is not all negative. It's not that every aspect of using this natural resource is bad, but we as a society need to temper what I would say the unthinking desire for material gain, if not environmental transformation, i.e. clearing those forests. So we have two pictures of post-war suburbs. This is Winnipeg, the big picture. The image on the top is Calgary, and the image on the bottom is Downsview. Now, not a tree in sight, nary a tree. Lots of cul-de-sacs, lots of middle-class propriety, lots of uptight people, men who are away, women who are bored with their lives, children who are being socialized to perpetuate the ideas of their parents. Wood in the service of modernity. This is B.C. Binning's house in West Vancouver, a landmark piece of modernist architecture designed in 1939. And then a tile design that sits on the facade of the BC Electric building in downtown Vancouver, which is now a condo because, of course, all important office buildings eventually become condos. Everything does. Everything becomes a condo. But Binning takes the BC forest and translates it into this remarkable prismatic design, which of course is a type of safe forest. It's a stylized forest. It's a good forest because it's in the middle of a city. And it's on a building that's interested in damming rivers to make hydroelectricity, so when you're home in your suburban house with your miserable marriage, you can click the lights on and read your book. Or turn the lights off and say, I'm tired. Or I have a headache. Canadian wood furniture, modern aesthetics, made the chair on the right, made in Toronto, and then the radio, the wood-framed radio in Ottawa. Reconversion after the war saw industries that had supplied the British and Allied war effort turning that industrial knowledge into domestic goods. And so these chairs, designed by Stefan Zawinski and Hilary Skycolt, were made at the Canadian Wooden Aircraft Company in London, Ontario. So if you're not making bombers anymore, make domestic goods for families, and a colored version. And this object, is it a good piece of design? It's trying hard. It's referencing Scandinavian modernism and the work of Alvar Aalto and Bruno Masson, but it comes across with that type of, I would say, Canadian earnestness that sometimes misses the mark. I mean, this, to my mind, and this is what I say often, that Canada is always striving for bronze. Molded tables never put into production, made out of BC fir. The lumber industry profiled in the book Canadian Woods about the idea of these are chairs for schools. Hilary Skycolt. This, I think, is a very accomplished piece of, I mean, it's an accomplished technological object, and aesthetically it achieves something. A different version. This was from the Design Exchange. Russ Spann furniture by Russell Spanner, made out of Canadian maple. His company was called Imperial Maple. He had a line of furniture called Loyalist Maple. So he very much sort of took on the idea of Upper Canadian settlement in the creation of modern objects for modern people. Although I don't know, however, how modern Canadians ever really were in the post-war period. You may know that the government in 1942 in Canada gave to Britain $1 billion, free and clear. A loan, it wasn't a loan, people thought it was a loan, it wasn't, it was a gift. So the Canadian people gifted Britain $1 billion because the government felt that Britain had borne the brunt of the Nazi bombing, so that's true, the Blitz, etc. But that $1 billion exodus of money forfeited for the Canadian public reconversion. And as a result, it's a sort of a side story. It meant that Canadian design was never really able to catch up. And it was also the sort of thin edge of the wedge that allowed for that wonderful thing, the branch plant economy. Small population, can't produce enough domestic goods because how many times do you need to buy a washing machine or a car? So why not have American industry employ Canadians, which is always important, by building essentially American things in Canada. And that's a template and a model in our design culture. More Russ Spann. Jan Kuiper's desk. Laurie McIntosh wooden chair. This desk was mass produced, but not so successful. 3 of these were made. So modern design in Canada out of wood, aspirational, but never because of the market. Canadians, you know, we're cautious consumers. You know, we like the idea of shopping, but we don't like shopping. We certainly like spending money. And so how often would you have to buy a modern chair? And if you did buy a modern chair, what would the neighbors say? Oh, you know what she has. But I always thought she was that type of person. Lots of fun at home with a homemade skiff made out of weather ply. So British Columbia products, motorboats. Again, a continuation of the technology of making airplanes applied to maritime life. Well, Bertrand Brinning, I showed you his house. If any of you ever have a chance to go to Vancouver, there is a Shoppers Drug Mart that used to be the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce on Pender. And Binning was given the commission, because his reputation as a maker of tile, to show BC industry. Would make sense, a bank, why would you not celebrate that? And it's really the upper third in, you see that forest of stylized trees, and then you see the logs, and then you see turned into paper. And what else do we have? Well, we have electricity, and we have chemistry, and we have agriculture, and we have fishing, etc. It's a remarkable panel. But what we don't see are Indigenous people. We don't see any type of acknowledgement of the history of the place. All we see is the taking of the natural bounty of the land. More stamps. This is an astonishing piece of design. Just the way that the shadow of the tree then becomes the unfurling piece of paper with the modern factory that allows that transformation. Paper. The largest paper roller in the world in Ontario. Canada Postage stamp. Trees into what? Yeah, the tools of everyday life. Newsprint. An image from the 1959 yearbook. And I show it to you not because it so privileges trees, excuse me, but we see several things. We see industrialization. We see this prismatic depiction of what seems to be the West Coast. There's an island with some pine trees on it. And of course, we see an Indigenous mask. Not a person, but a mask. A type of absent presence. The hauntology of settler materialism. From 1961. If you do an inventory of these books, the majority of images on the cover, trees. This is Canada. This is the yearbook promoting Canadian industry and Canadian life, and how best to characterize or symbolize Canada, but through forests. But if you think about the statistics that I showed you at the beginning, at a certain point, there won't be any forests. The forest will be the equivalent of the Haida Mask, where the people are absent and all we have is a memory of what used to be that forest. 1962. Housing starts in Calgary. 1976. Trees in autumn. Postage stamp for a series called by Canada Post the Resource Industries series. Never produced. But here is the stamp. Well, the last section of my talk, part 3. And I hope we're doing okay. Thank you so much. You're so patient. So I gave you a quick definition of the term Anthropocene. So this idea of geological time finally being named for people who've changed it. Global warming, sea rise, the melting of the ice caps, all of that. But there is something within this moment in time which I would equate to the love we have for disaster movies. That most of us really can't imagine changing our behavior because I like my car a lot, I really do. It has gas. I like the fact I have electricity. I like the fact I fly to places all the time. I'm aware, always, on one side of my brain that everything I'm doing is against everything I stand for. But Freud, remember, gives us that essay called Beyond the Pleasure Principle, in which he says human beings can know absolutely that their behaviors will be their undoing, but they will not change their behaviors. It may well be that this moment in ecological time is about the pleasure principle and the implications. This is an image by the photographer Edward Bertinsky. He did an amazing series of works, I mean, he's a very distinguished maker, called the Anthropocene, in which he went around the world looking at ecological destruction and devastation. He would say that this work is a documentary photo. You can buy it at Nicolas-Métavier Gallery for $85,000. Now, that's not me indicting him, but it does raise the question about you're photographing lumber in BC as a point of what clear cut, and we can look past that edge of trees. And so you just look at, if you're on a boat going by, you would see that lovely row of trees next to the shore, and then if you landed on the shore and you walked 40 feet in, you'd be in slash and burn clear cut. And so here he gives us this picture. But this isn't simply a manifesto visualized for us to question rapacious extractive industry. It's a work of art that's a commodity. So can you profit from documenting the end of the world? Within Canadian design, there are any number, contemporary Canadian design, there is what I see as a type of postmodern irony, where Canadian designers use the tropes that have long defined the place, an interest in wood, but an interest in wood that's domesticated or used for profit. So this is Loyal Loot Collective out of Edmonton, and these are called their tree bowls. So this is their publicity shot where they stack the bowls up that look like trees. And then if you look into the bowls, they're brightly colored and quite wonderful. This is their coat hang, which is a smart, witty object of laminated birch in which there has been an intentionally exfoliated piece. This was in True Nordic, and I wrote with my colleague, Dr. Rachel Gottlieb, the text panel for this. And I said, this is the work of some very gifted axewoman who knows exactly how to hit the wood to get a result. But here we have this object made out of wood that serves a domestic purpose of putting your clothes on it. And probably not the clothes that you're using to clear your land and grow crops, but probably the coat you take off having been out for dinner in downtown Toronto or Vancouver. So the idea of bringing the natural world into that aspirational modernist interior. Bertinsky, clear cut in British Columbia. This tree, probably 1,100 years old, and was surrounded by trees of comparable age. Gone. 1,100 years. This was cut down 8 years ago, so that would have been what, 2016? So 1,100 minus 2016 takes us back to when? And you think what's happening in the world at that point in time? And so that tree, just in its little environment, doing its thing over 1,000 years, gone. Gone. Brent Comer, Vancouver-based, very talented furniture maker who only uses reclaimed and found wood. So beach combs and looks for submerged logs. And this table is called his stacked table. The idea of taking an axe and chopping a log and creating an object. So it's at once referential to a long history of industry in Canada, but it also serves, because of how he sources his materials, as a very sort of powerful critique. I think to live with this object, and I know this object well, is, as Comer would have it, a reminder about the fragile balance that all of us need to acknowledge as we live in this world. The brothers Dressler, very gifted makers. Their work was in True Nordic. This is a bench they've designed for, if you've been to Toronto, the Well. You know about the Well? This new building at the bottom of Spadina? Something else. It's Manhattan comes to town, basically, with this very nice curvaceous wood object, because the presence of wood in a modernist interior is not so different of the presence of some anthropological object, an indigenous mask or a piece of African sculpture in a modernist interior. It's a counterweight, it's a counterpoint. The Dresser Brothers electrified chandelier called Tree Branch Chandelier. Very appealing object. The idea that you would simulate the bower above you in your domestic setting and you electrify it. So there's a little bit of perversity there, but there's also a lot of elegance and appeal. This is a little more as you see it. So the idea that what is the foundation of domesticity but the natural world? So when you sit down to your Sunday dinner or whatever, your fancy brunch, of course you should sit at a table the supports of which, metaphorically, actually, culturally, are the trees. Dresser's Brothers Curvaceous Lounge, made out of black walnut. Matthew Croker's Sit With Me bench. Croker, based in Winnipeg, works for the company called Palliser. If any of you are ever in need of a walking stick, Brent Croker designed the most phenomenal walking stick made out of Canadian woods, but it has a rubber handle. It's ergonomically fantastic. He's a very, very gifted designer. And he made this object in a response to Canada. He sort of thought it might be the Two Solitudes bench, so a little bit of French, a little bit of English. It might be I love you, but I don't love you enough, or I used to love you, but I don't love you now, or maybe I could love you again. We'll have to see, or maybe I just have to talk to you across the room because I can't decide if I love you. Castor Design Studio. We saw our friends the beaver. Here Castor takes a witty turn. Rather than having a tree being gnawed by a beaver, it's a cast concrete object. It's hand-formed. It's concrete that then is hand-away chipped. I find it a really sort of lovely, modern, contemporary modernist object that's full of all the references to the world. Coasters, because who wouldn't want that glass of single malt on a reminder of the forest that used to stand where your condo now sits? Wooden bowls with live edges, but they're not live, they're dead. Clear cut. This is Cape Breton. And now to the last part of our last part, Indigenous housing. The United Nations has called out Canada as a sovereign country for neglecting its Indigenous people, saying that the living conditions of many nations across the country are appalling. We live in one of the world's richest democracies, wealth beyond imagination, and yet the original custodians, I think, isn't that what the land acknowledgement talks about, of the waters and the trees? Those custodians are relegated to parts of the land under our auspices as settlers, the Indian Act and all of that, and live in these conditions of mold, of disease. So this is in Northern Ontario. Wood, cheap wood products for the domestic market used to hobble together habitations for nations that once cared for the land, had their wigwams, were stewards of the natural wonder. Well, these commentaries come effectively to us through the work of the artist Yuxawa Teplin from Vancouver, and this is called Lone Survivor, showing clear-cut in the Claycoit Sound. This is from 2009. Claycoit Sound. Indigenous housing in Northern Ontario. Manitoba. This is the one lone tree. All of his family and his friends are dead. More Yuxawa Teplin work, taking the motifs of the Haida Nation as a commentary on the way that Canadian capitalist resource extraction works on unceded land of Indigenous peoples. British Columbia, 96% of that province is unceded. Northern Manitoba. Illegal clear-cutting in First Nations lands. British Columbia. Yuxawa Teplin. And then lastly, a settler object designed by Partisans, a Toronto-based firm. This is in, you're absolutely right, Muskoka. Where else would it be? That's a wonderful world up there. The water, the trees, the money, the Mercedes, the Volvos, the Maseratis, the avant-garde architecture like this made out of Canadian wood. These worlds that you can escape to as Canadians, because we do love our cabins in the woods, our little clearings, as long as we can get back on the 403 and get back to Toronto. And then, immerse ourselves in commerce and aspirational desires. And I use that word aspirational a lot because I do think that Canadians are so profoundly modest and so profoundly wanting. And so this cabin, as the last image in the slideshow, I think speaks to the genuine brilliance of contemporary designers, but also in light of this. How do we reconcile it as a people? What are our obligations as settlers to our fellows, to our lands? And when does the call of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission actually become action? And I want to end with your permission, just to read something I wrote. I told you that my work has changed because of reading the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I try now. And I said, so this I wrote for a lecture I gave in Vancouver, which got a lot of people really pissed off. But so be it. I said, how can or should a history of design in Canada be told in the present circumstances of a national project of truth and reconciliation when we're asked to consider the hideous treatment by settlers towards Indigenous peoples? Is it possible to continue using long-established narrative models that focus on authorship, creativity, form, materiality, fabrication strategies, and use in the context of a consumerist model that is not shared by all citizens in the country? In light of the devastating consequences of the statist policies of exclusion and cultural erasure, and in light of the complex consequences of what can be understood as the modernist project, we're still in it, then how can we as a people change our behavior? Is it possible to simply retell what is an often familiar story of design ingenuity and the development of national design history? The answer to the question is not an easy one. It is not easy because while the idea of a history of design represents both an acknowledgement of the role of precedent and experimentation and innovation, it also privileges a narrative that can only succeed by the denial of the forces that bring modernity into existence. Thank you so much for your time. Such a pleasure.
I'm just going to say wow, and look forward to taking questions from the audience. Obviously, this was a very...
I'm going to sit in the turquoise
Have
modernist
a
chair,
ch-
if that's allowed.
Do you know who designed it?
I don't, but I assume it's fantastic. It's a very nice thing. Thank you for thinking of me like that. So,
Happy to take questions from our audience. This was a vast and, well, capacious talk, let's say. You have a question?
Thank you. Brilliant presentation. Not a question, just to follow up a little
Please.
closer to town. In Trenton, in the 1850s to the 1890s, a family named Gilmore, the father, son, and grandfather, put through 100 to 140,000 logs per day, and they were, excuse me, Trenton had the biggest sawmill in the world in the 1850s.
thank you. I did not know that. I'm very grateful to you for knowing that. It's in keeping. So, again, thank you.
At what point in our history did we develop a sensitivity to environmental issues?
It's a big question. I think there's always been an awareness about land stewardship, but historically it was geared to agriculture. The idea of crop rotation and making sure that pasturage was fertilized in certain ways. I don't think what we would call environmental activism or stewardship around forest management has ever kept up with that. And I know that there's lots of work by Macmillan Bloedel, and the Irvings, of course, would say that they're doing good things, and I'm sure they are. But it's a little too late, I would say. But I'm not sure I'm answering your question, sir. Am I getting to something that you were after, or?
No, I was wondering, when did it start? When did we become aware?
You mean sort of the activism of today? Oh, now I understand. I think the Clayoquot Sound issue really brought to the minds of many Canadians that these old-growth forests were being cut down for no justifiable reason, and that when you have, Americans, didn't Robert Kennedy come up here and sit in a tree, or there were and Hollywood people came up and said it's an outrage. What's that?
I'm sure Goldie Hawn did.
Well, I mean, probably so. And so I think that moment, when was it, 1998, 97, that there suddenly was this dawning of awareness. But, BC, I think, has always hogged the limelight around natural beauty. And so people don't care about Cape Breton. They don't really care about northern Quebec. We can look at the devastation of Quebec. That's not getting the attraction of Goldie Hawn. She's lovely, by the way. But that moment when you see National Geographic profiling the Clayoquot, I think that might have done something to the public consciousness. But not enough. Not enough. I mean, I just finished a book about architecture in British Columbia, and I, even though I was there more often than I thought I would be, I had the great advantage and luxury of driving around the province. And I made a point of looking for clear cut. And I would, when I had to drive to a house somewhere I would then say, let's go look. And so I would get satellite maps so I could look at the destruction. And it continues. It continues. I mean, I don't see anyone saying we need to stop cutting trees down in Canada. So your question's a really good one about when it happened. I'm not sure what would be next in making us as a people rethink what is an irreplaceable and fragile resource. I mean, it's the world. It's our place. So thank you for that.
Hi there. Thank you. Great presentation. I wanted to ask about the idea of design in the indigenous culture. What did they do with wood other than totem poles and canoes and things that were notable from a design standpoint?
Bowls, foodwares, seating, baskets. I mean, vast array of things depending on available materials. So we can look at the material culture of indigenous peoples from what's present-day Nova Scotia, problematically called, to present-day British Columbia. And you see the availability of things in the woods being used for the making of what I'll call domestic implements. So. Well, you mentioned totem poles. I call it family poles. Architecture. I mean, you know, indigenous architecture in the West Coast, remarkable for those longhouses made out of stone tools. You know, you look at the early accounts by people like Mears, a sea captain, and Spanish explorers who went up the coast, marveled at these exquisitely finely made, I'm using bad words, but these significant pieces of domestic architecture. It's a great question, so thank you.
This was sort of an observation and a question too. I'm from British Columbia and I lived for 7 decades there before coming here. And
where? I have to know where.
Vancouver area.
Oh, that area, yeah, it's a good place, yeah.
But I worked on the tugboats as a young man, and I took the paper barges from coming down the coast from Ocean Falls and right on the money there.
Yes.
So one thing that strikes me is that in so many rural areas through the west coast of British Columbia and Vancouver Island, including that, there's this concept of a fringe along the highway, which is a shield or a screen,
yes,
which I guess is probably mandated by the Ministry of Forests to hide from us what's gone on behind them.
Absolutely.
Which we can usually see because the hills are quite large. The trees don't totally hide it.
You're correct.
But it's the falsifying aspect of that is really quite disgusting when you think back to what we were doing.
Hideous.
Not facing up to the reality of what we were creating.
There's another reason why you have to have the fringe on highways, because if you cut all the trees down, the soil becomes loose and you can have rock slides. So that band of trees at the highway is not only decorative, but it also might be a type of safety precaution.
Yeah, I understand that.
But that even adds to the patheticness of the situation, I would say. Thank you for your comments. Ocean Falls.
Am I next?
Hello.
Hi. I'm really interested in having you explore, the relationship between our psyche and the place that trees and forests and clearing hold in it, and the chronic problem with productivity and innovation in Canada.
It's a fantastic question. Well, you know, I think it goes to the deeper questions of Canadian identity, and this takes us to Bailey, that the colonial person, and we are colonial to this day, is always slightly stunted, always slightly anxious, never feeling that they can measure up. There's a type of dependence and a type of fear of thriving, which is why we have in Canada tall poppy syndrome, if you know that idea. So you think about those people in Canada who do really, really well, like too well, and it's like, you're getting too big for your britches. And so the option is either we're gonna cut you down to size, we're gonna cut the top off that poppy, or that person will go to America. Because the United States will valorize brilliance and valorize exceptionalism and valorize like, yeah, I'm better than all the rest of you and I'm gonna go prove it, but I'm gonna go to Los Angeles or whatever it is. Where Canadians are like, oh dear, oh no, sorry. And Bailey talks about that. So I think to your point about technological innovation, Canada has remarkable tech firms that do really well. To a point. And then the question is, and this is why your question is so good, that to a point we ask, well, why is it that you can't get to is it the striving for bronze? Good enough. It's good enough. You don't have to show off. And I remember, just if I can tell an anecdote, when I got accepted to go do my PhD at Harvard, and I say that because this is part of the story, a professor at the University of New Brunswick said, oh, you should apply to the IODE for some money. And I thought, oh, okay, so the International Order of the Daughters of the Empire. Fine. So I thought, okay, fine. So I applied, and you were not asked where you were going. You were simply asked to say what you planned to do for a PhD. So I had a master's degree, fine. So I wrote. So then I got this note in the mail saying, could I call Miss Hill? Miss Hill. So I phoned Miss Hill, and she said, oh, you know, very nice, very impressive, et cetera. She said, so you must be going to the University of Toronto. And or McGill, those are, and I said, well, no, I'm actually going to Harvard. She goes, oh, we don't fund Republican universities. And I said, nor should you. I mean, absolutely not. But I said, so if I can ask, because you know you're not giving me any money, which is fine. What's the issue? She said, why are you abandoning your country? And I thought, oh, she's actually making a point. I mean, the very thing that I have sort of acknowledged that perhaps I'm criticizing, that, you know, we leave as opposed to, you know, I could have gone to U of T, that would have been very nice, I'm sure. But then I also thought, no, I'm not going to say no to Harvard, because why would I? But that dynamic, I think, speaks to success is often seen as lying outside of our borders, whether we think of Britain, the old colonial whatever, or the United States, which is so seductive and bad. I mean, who doesn't want to be American, but nobody does, but in fact we do. Is that sort of... Well, well, you know, at the Design Exchange, if I can just offer one other anecdote. So, you know, as Barbara noted, Canada's first museum of industrial history, it was a disaster from day one. Disaster. No one wanted to come see Canadian industrial products, they just didn't. It was founded as a type of incubator for entrepreneurship and creativity. John Chrétien opened it. The federal government gave lots of money. Rachel Gottlieb was the first curator. I was the second. We established this collection. But people were like, well, you know, Canadian design, and I agree with this. It's good, but it's not at the world level. And so you think, what would it take for all of the brilliance of Canadians to be nurtured sufficiently at home as to make things that strive for gold and are not emulative? The objects I showed you, the modernist furniture, they're all copies of other things. So the question is, what is originality in the Canadian context? I think graphic design as a profession has a far more distinguished history in Canada than any other sort of design profession. But I think around the making of goods, the branch plan economy, and the fact that where do we look for inspiration? In a project, I will be quiet in a moment, I was asked by Bloomsbury, that's doing a 3-volume history of world design, big project, and I'm writing about Canada. On the one hand, I think, do you really want me to write about Canada? I don't think I'm the best person to write about Canada. And they said, so you're not really celebrating Canadian design? I said, no. No, I'm telling the story of Canadian design that's caught between the history of colonialism and the aspiration of America, that is the lure of America. And that's the fact. The only place in Canada, other than graphic design, is Quebec. Quebec has a brilliant industrial design culture. And you think, well, okay, how do we explain that? Because it's a nation. And it's a nation that has found a way of using history as a galvanizing force for forging a realistic, striving world. So Quebec design between 1940 and 1990, just astonishing stuff. English Canada doesn't have a patch on it. Anyway, so this is in this chapter, and I've had some colleagues saying, do you really want to do this? I said, well, I mean, I can't lie. Anyway, we'll see. Hello.
Hello. I was wondering if you have any comments on mass timber in architecture.
Absolutely. It's a very important development for lots of reasons. CO, it's a wonderful sort of way of combating CO release. We know that because of the problems with steel, it's economical. So I had a friend who, in fact, was an architect in Boston, and he knew I was giving this talk. And he said, oh, so he sent me this lovely essay about mass timber. And he said, that is the future. And he said, as long as we have carefully managed forests and we make sure that they're replenished, et cetera, there's a very good future for mass timber construction. And University of British Columbia has the tallest mass timber building now of any place in the country. And it's really a superb structure. And George Baird, who we acknowledged, who, if you don't know him, passed away 2 weeks ago, he was a great champion, saying that there needs to be a type of ecological mindedness in architecture that uses mass timber, while at the same time, a broader ecological mindedness to make sure that we protect our forests. So it's a very good question. Thank you for that. Yes, please.
Michael, you mentioned in your talk about a walking stick with a rubber handle on it.
Yes.
It reminded me, my brother-in-law was over to visit me recently and was in the garage, and he saw my hockey sticks, and he goes, oh my God, I haven't seen a wooden hockey stick for ages.
Right.
They're now made out of carbon.
Yes.
And I looked above my hockey stick, and there were metal snowshoes instead of wood. And 3
Right.
years ago, I commissioned a goalie lacrosse stick from the Mohawk tribe outside of Cornwall because I played when I was a kid. Could you, we also as a group read about baseball where they cut down 40,000 ash trees to make baseball bats.
Yes.
The professional leagues only allow wooden because they don't like the sound of metal bats.
Right.
Can you talk a bit about the tactile quality of having a piece of wood in your hand, the sound, the smell? How is it nostalgia? Should we be replacing, not making that many, cutting down that many trees to make a bat just because we don't like the sound it makes? Because we are driven to the tactile quality of.
I mean, I think the baseball example is problematic. I don't think that the oral condition of an aluminum bat shouldn't mean we can't use aluminum bats, because the performance is the same, if not better. That's where tradition may be getting in the way. I'm not against. Don't take my talk as saying we shouldn't use wood. I think wood furniture is remarkable. All of that. I like old objects. I like new objects. I like that Muskoka house, even though I hate that Muskoka house, etc. I just think it's that the obligations of a people, of a nation at this point in time, needs to push back against corporate and global conglomerates that would say we can clear-cut forests and we can take 11 million hectares of land in order to pulp. For what? Pulp. Where is our recycling initiative? We know that in the city of Toronto, for example, people love the metro and they love the sun and love the star and all that. Well, maybe not, they don't love the star, but all of that stuff. And most of that paper is not recycled. And you think, why not? Why doesn't a government say, we're only going to produce paper that can be repurposed in some way? Maybe it's diminished in quality, who knows? But those types of legislative initiatives we do not see. So the metal snowshoes, metal was the replacement for wood. There was a whole idea that that was a material of the future, so why wouldn't you replace it? But at the same time, we like wood and it's nostalgic. I was showing my students the other day, Alvar Aalto had a wife named Aino. So Alvar Aalto, this Finnish architect. So if Aino was an architect, she graduated with a higher thing in their architecture school than he did. And she was remarkable because she believed in the haptic, H-A-P-T-I-C. And the haptic is the idea that I can put my hand on this, and it's not only that it supports me, but it actually corresponds to my hand. And she designed a line of, because she was a mother, and because she fought against heteropatriarchy that said she should be at home cooking for her children rather than out there designing buildings, she made a series of dishes set in pine, glass objects set in these pine dishes. But if you touch the edge of the pine dish, it fits the hand perfectly. She knew exactly where the fingers would go. And she made them of different sizes because of children. So smaller hands, different types of things, etc. So I give you that example because I like wood immensely. I live with wood. But I also am from British Columbia. And I just think these are not reconcilable realities. Our romance of wooden things and our romance of forests and our inability to say maybe we need to keep those forests and not transform them. So the wood baseball bat, that's wrong. Metal snowshoes, not so bad. I know Aalto's dishes, That's humanity. The last piece, Indigenous people should not live with black mold in shitty houses in the richest country. We're profoundly, water poisoning. That's the other, you didn't hear me talk about water and waterborne diseases. And our current Prime Minister, who I will send money to the Liberal Party, I write to him and saying, "Dear Prime Minister, when are you going to make good on the promise of having clean water for Indigenous nations? When?" Never happens. Never happens. So I think all of us, in light of the TRC and in light of where Canada is, we need to find our inner activists, and we need to start changing things, because we are settlers. We're here, and we benefit from the bounty of this place at the expense of the people who, by the land acknowledgement, were the stewards of the land until we decided to take that role over. And we've done such a great job of that. Thank you so much for the evening, everybody. Real pleasure to be here.
Thank you. On behalf of NLC and our audience, that was astounding and thought-provoking, thoughtful talk. And thank you, Michael. I know he loves wood because he actually scored a beautiful Queen Anne table at Habitat for Humanity today. So he's upcycling. I think that's a good way to not cut down trees but use them again. I do want to say you certainly didn't strive for bronze, so thank you. And I know Elizabeth has a few closing remarks about our final remaining events.
Thanks, Barb. I'll be fast. So thank you for listening for a minute. Tomorrow, first of all, that was fantastic. I'm still trying to crack that productivity nut, you know? I feel it's important that we do that. I don't know if, always fascinating to think about what's behind the Canadian psyche, and you gave us some great insight, so what a remarkable talk tonight. Tomorrow, we're going to have another interesting discussion on Zoom with two PhD candidates from U of T who are going to talk about why access to nature can be driven by race and how we can change that maybe. And is the Green Belt just another example of white privilege, something I would never considered, but they raised in our discussion the other day. So if you haven't registered, I really encourage you to do that. It's tomorrow at 10 o'clock. It's on Zoom. You can go online tonight and buy a ticket. That would be great. These young women are both super keen to come out and speak to us, very knowledgeable and passionate. And then on Sunday, the concert that will feature David Newland. How many people heard it advertised on Saturday morning on CBC Radio? That was so nice to hear. Anyway, David Newland's put together an amazing afternoon of songs and stories. Kids are free. What better way to spend a Sunday afternoon in November? And then finally, next week, most of you got an email, because I think most of you will be coming to the Manuel Lima talk. And I'm sorry he won't be here in person, but he will be giving us the same talk over Zoom. So if you haven't heard about that, check your email. Okay, the last thing I want to say is, that was supposed to be the last thing, but this is it, really. We have a really great board and fantastic volunteers at NLC. I've been doing it for 10 years. We have Wayne, who's been doing it for a lot longer. I've been doing the website and marketing for 7 years, and then 3 years I took on the chair role. So many people, Barb is one, there's a bunch of others, Dawn in the back, and Joanne, and I'm gonna talk about Susan and Paul in a minute, put in so many hours, and Karen, our program committee chair in the back, you know, behind the scenes, there's a lot of effort, discussion, hours, interesting times. We enjoy what we do. We would love to have new people join us. We need a new treasurer, and we need someone to help with venues. We need program committee people. We're not asking you to sign up for life. We're just asking you to think about, if you enjoy this and you'd like to help, please come and talk to me. And then before we say goodnight, I want to please shout out to our amazing treasurer, Susan Snyder, who I think has just snuck out. I hope she hasn't. Where is she? There she is, who's leaving the board at the end of this year. She's been such a fantastic help to all of us, keeping the finances organized. We could not have done it without her. I don't know how we're going to do it, but we'll try. Susan, thank you. And to Paul Macklin, standing beside her, who has been managing the venues for the last 3 years. And again, don't know how we're going to do it without him. We will try. They're both going to be very much missed. And thank you both so much for everything you've done for NLC. And thank all of you for coming tonight. Good night.